In my first life, I was Celine Ward, the dutiful daughter of a powerful senator whose every move was scrutinized by society and whose every smile was expected to be perfect, polished, and sincere even when my world was crumbling inside, and I thought I had done everything right by choosing Marcus Vale, the man who seemed to embody charm and loyalty, the man who courted me with whispered promises and the kind of devotion that soothed the insecurities I never dared voice. But what I didn't know was that my best friend Isabel, dazzling and ambitious, had been at his side all along, their whispered conversations hidden behind closed doors, their stolen glances disguised as concern for me, and on the night of the grand political gala where I thought my engagement would be celebrated, I found out the truth in the cruelest way possible when Isabel slipped something into my drink as Marcus smiled at me like I was the only woman alive, and then the balcony blurred before my eyes, the floor tilting as the crowd gasped and I fell, my body crashing onto the marble below, their voices crying accident even as I saw Isabel's satisfied smile and Marcus's cold relief, and in those final seconds, all I could feel was the hollow ache of betrayal, my name destined to be smeared, my family disgraced, my life cut short before I had the chance to fight back, but fate, it seemed, was not finished with me, for instead of darkness I awoke gasping in my old bedroom weeks before the engagement was announced, my hands trembling as I touched the silk sheets, the faint glow of morning seeping through curtains I thought I would never see again, and the ring that had bound me to Marcus was not yet on my finger, the scandal had not yet been written, and I realized with breathless clarity that I had been given a chance to rewrite everything, to take the knowledge of my murder and transform it into my greatest weapon, and this time I would not waste my life trusting snakes disguised as lovers and friends. For if Marcus had thought me weak and Isabel had thought me blind, they would learn how dangerous a woman reborn could become, and I already knew the man I would seek, the one they feared too much to ever confront, Lucian Draven, the cold-eyed tech magnate whose empire was built on secrets and steel, whose name alone could silence a room, and though I had never dared approach him in my past life, this time I would, because only someone like Lucian could help me dismantle Marcus and Isabel piece by piece until nothing remained of their stolen triumphs but ashes beneath my feet. The days that followed were a haze of disbelief and calculation, for every sound and sight reminded me that I was living again in a world I had already lost once, and as I walked through the Ward estate I could not stop remembering how it had ended, the whispers that my fall had been the result of too much wine, the headlines that painted me as fragile and careless, the smug photographs of Marcus and Isabel appearing arm in arm mere months after my death, her hand adorned with jewels that had once been mine, and now every polite word from them rang false in my ears as I forced myself to play the part of the trusting Celine they remembered, smiling sweetly as Marcus sent me flowers, listening as Isabel chattered about dresses and luncheons, but beneath that mask a fire burned hotter with each passing hour, for I knew the truth and they did not know that I knew, and that gave me power. A secret advantage I intended to sharpen into a blade, yet vengeance could not be achieved alone. Not against a man like Marcus who thrived on manipulation and a woman like Isabel who spun lies as easily as silk, and so I thought of Lucian Draven, the enigmatic titan of the tech world whose empire reached into every corner of society, a man whispered about with equal parts awe and terror, said to ruin competitors overnight with a single keystroke. A man who never smiled in public and whose enemies seemed to vanish without explanation, and I remembered how in my past life my father had once dismissed him as too dangerous to ally with, while Marcus had scoffed at his ruthless efficiency, but I now saw him for what he was, the one figure whose cold brilliance could outmatch Marcus's deceit and Isabel's ambition, and so I began to lay the groundwork by gathering every scrap of information I could find, attending luncheons I had once found tedious, listening not for gossip about gowns but for murmurs of Lucian's latest acquisitions, and I practiced the poise I would need to stand before him, because I understood that approaching him unprepared would mean being dismissed, or worse, destroyed, and at night I lay awake rehearsing the words that might capture his attention, words that would make him see me not as a spoiled politician's daughter but as a potential ally, a woman who had tasted betrayal and who was willing to trade her soul if it meant survival, and as the weeks passed, as the engagement loomed closer, I knew time was running thin, so when I heard whispers that Lucian would attend a foreign investment summit in the city, I seized the chance, donning the kind of gown that turned heads and hiding the steel in my heart beneath painted lips, and I told myself that tonight, I would step into his orbit, and nothing would ever be the same again. The summit glittered with chandeliers and marble floors, the air thick with the perfume of money and ambition, but all of it blurred into the background as soon as Lucian Draven arrived, tall and severe in a perfectly cut suit as black as midnight, his expression as unreadable as a mask carved from stone, and though conversations faltered when he passed, he moved as if the room were empty, his cold eyes scanning faces not for admiration but for weakness, and in that moment I understood why so many feared him, because he carried himself like a man who had already calculated the outcome of every move before anyone else even stepped onto the board, yet it was precisely that presence I needed to capture. So I waited until my father drifted toward the senators clustered near the stage and Isabel excused herself to gossip with socialites, then I slipped through the throng, weaving between financiers and politicians until I stood at the edge of Lucian's orbit, my pulse hammering but my smile serene, and when his gaze finally flicked toward me, sharp and appraising, I forced my voice steady as I said, "Mr. Draven, I believe you and I could be of use to one another." And though his brow arched ever so slightly, he did not dismiss me outright, instead regarding me with the silence of a predator measuring its prey, before he murmured, "Is that so? You don't look like someone who understands what I require," his words low, almost disinterested, but I held his gaze and replied softly, "Appearances deceive, as I'm sure you know better than anyone," and for the briefest instant I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, not warmth but intrigue. Before he stepped aside, his voice quiet and commanding, "Walk with me." And as I followed him through the corridors that hummed with the echo of muted conversations, I felt both terror and exhilaration, for I knew that this was the first step onto a path from which there would be no return, a path that would entwine my fate with Lucian Draven's in ways I could neither predict nor control. He led me down a side hallway lined with portraits of past magnates, their painted eyes following us as though bearing witness to a pact not yet spoken, and when we reached the terrace that overlooked the city skyline, Lucian stopped, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his posture the very embodiment of control, and for a long moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against my ribs like a weight, testing whether I would crack under the pressure, but I stood firm because I had already broken once in my first life and I refused to bend again. And finally he turned his head just enough for the faint gleam of the city lights to catch in his eyes as he said, "You approached me as though you have something to bargain with, yet I see only a senator's daughter playing at intrigue," his voice smooth but edged with dismissal, and though my heart lurched at the threat of rejection I forced myself to step closer, my voice steady even as my palms dampened. "I know who Marcus Vale really is, I know the secrets he hides from investors and the debts he buries under charm, and I know that Isabel, the woman who calls herself my closest friend, conspires with him to take what should never belong to them." And his gaze sharpened at that, the smallest tilt of his head betraying interest as I pressed on, lowering my tone to a whisper that trembled with fury, "They murdered me once, Mr. Draven, they destroyed my life and left me with nothing, but this time I intend to destroy them first, and I need someone who can make the world believe in my power before I even lift a finger, someone like you." And though I had said too much, though I had revealed more emotion than I intended, Lucian only studied me in that calculating way of his before replying, "Murdered you once," the faintest curl of mockery in his voice, but when I didn't flinch, when I met his skepticism with a gaze cold enough to match his, he let the silence hang a beat longer before saying, "If your words are madness, then at least they are entertaining, and if they are truth, then you are more dangerous than you look." And with that he pulled a card from his breast pocket and slid it into my hand, the embossed name gleaming under the terrace light, his voice low and commanding, "Find me when you have something I can use, Celine Ward, but know this, if you waste my time, I will end you myself." And as he walked away, leaving me trembling on the balcony with the city roaring beneath my feet, I felt no fear, only the exhilaration of having stepped into the orbit of a man who might just be the key to rewriting my fate. From that night forward, every glance at Marcus and Isabel became easier to endure, because beneath my practiced smiles I held the weight of Lucian's card in my pocket like a loaded weapon, a reminder that I was no longer powerless, and as the engagement dinners multiplied and Isabel wrapped her arm around mine with feigned sisterly devotion, I found myself imagining the look on her face when she realized I had slipped beyond her control, but I knew I couldn't run to Lucian with nothing but words and vengeance, because he was a man who trafficked in leverage, not sentiment. So I began watching Marcus more closely than ever, noting the calls he made when he thought no one listened, the letters he locked away in his study, the unexplained absences that even Isabel seemed not to question, and one evening, while slipping quietly through the back corridor of the estate, I heard his voice sharp and desperate through the door, begging for an extension from someone whose tone was far colder than his, and in that instant I understood that Marcus's debts ran deeper than I ever imagined, his desperation heavier than I could have hoped, so I stole into his study after he left, my fingers trembling as I opened drawers and discovered hidden ledgers inked with names of shadow investors and quiet payments made to silence them, the kind of evidence Lucian could use to carve Marcus apart piece by piece, and though my throat tightened with fear as I copied down every figure by candlelight, I remembered the sound of my body hitting marble, the gasp of the crowd, Isabel's smile, and I swore I would never again allow them to script my downfall. So when I walked into Lucian's office days later, the walls lined with glass that reflected the city's neon glow, I laid the stolen documents before him without flinching, and though his face betrayed nothing, I saw the glint in his eyes as he leaned forward, the corners of his lips almost curving upward, and he murmured, "Perhaps you are not a waste of my time after all." Lucian did not praise me, not in the way ordinary men might with smiles or soft words. Instead he dissected the documents with the precision of a surgeon, his sharp eyes scanning every line while I sat across from him in silence, my heart pounding as though it might betray my resolve, and after what felt like an eternity he looked up and said, "Marcus Vale has tied himself to vultures who will tear him apart the moment his charm falters, but vultures are useful if properly directed," and I realized then that Lucian saw every weakness not as an end but as a tool, a piece of a larger puzzle only he could see in its entirety. And though his presence unnerved me, I found myself leaning into it, craving his guidance, because he was offering me more than just revenge. He was offering me mastery of a game I had never been allowed to play, so when he laid out the first step, a plan to quietly feed Marcus's creditors just enough information to panic them into pulling back funds, I agreed without hesitation, even though it meant risking everything if Marcus suspected me, and for weeks I lived a double life, attending luncheons and fittings with Isabel at my side, pretending to beam as Marcus kissed my hand in public, while at night I carried scraps of overheard names and stolen memos to Lucian's towering office, where he pieced them together with unnerving clarity, and though he never softened, never let slip a word of comfort, there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when his gaze lingered too long on me, when his hand brushed mine as he passed a folder, and each time my breath caught against my will, for I knew I was walking a dangerous line, one where vengeance and something perilously like desire blurred together, and yet I could not step back. Not when Lucian's voice, low and assured, promised me not safety, but power, a kind of power I had hungered for all my life without ever naming it. The first ripple of our plan struck with brutal precision when whispers of Marcus's instability began circulating among the investors he depended on, and though nothing concrete had been revealed, the fear of collapse was enough to rattle them, and I watched with hidden delight as Marcus fumbled through excuses at dinners, his smile too wide, his hands tightening around his glass as though it alone anchored him to the room, while Isabel's attempts to soothe him only revealed the strain beneath. Her painted veneer, her laughter pitched too high, her gaze flickering toward me with a hint of suspicion she quickly smothered, but I gave her nothing, only the same serene smile she remembered from before, though inside I savored her discomfort like wine. And that night when I relayed the details to Lucian, his eyes glinted with satisfaction though his tone remained as cold as ever. "Good, he's bleeding but doesn't yet know the wound is fatal," and I shivered at the calm certainty in his voice, not from fear but from the thrill of watching Marcus stumble closer to ruin, and yet in the quiet that followed, when Lucian poured himself a drink and handed it to me without asking, our fingers brushing as the glass passed between us, I felt a different kind of tremor, one that unsettled me more than the risks of our schemes, for beneath the armor of his ruthlessness there was something I had begun to recognize. A flicker of recognition when he looked at me too long, a silence waited. Not with calculation but with something more dangerous, and though he said nothing, the air between us thickened until I had to break it by murmuring, "What happens when he falls?" To which Lucian replied, his gaze locked on mine, "Then we make sure he never rises again," and though his words should have chilled me, I found myself unable to look away, wondering if I had become addicted not only to vengeance, but to the man who was teaching me how to wield it. It was Isabel who moved first, her instincts sharper than Marcus's arrogance, for she began appearing at my side with more persistence than ever, insisting on accompanying me to fittings, pressing gifts into my hands, her smile stretched too wide as though she were trying to read the secrets written beneath my skin, and one afternoon over tea she leaned forward, her voice low and honeyed as she said, "You've changed, Celine. You look at Marcus differently, you even speak differently. Is there something I should know?" And though every nerve in my body burned to expose her treachery, I forced a laugh, squeezing her hand as though we were still the closest of friends, saying lightly, "Perhaps I've simply grown up," while inside I imagined the moment I would finally crush that false sweetness into dust. Yet her words rattled me enough that I sought Lucian that evening, pacing his office with uncharacteristic agitation until he finally cut me off with a single cold command, "Sit," and when I obeyed he studied me with that piercing gaze before murmuring, "If Isabel senses change, let her. Curiosity is a leash that pulls people straight into the trap, but panic is what kills them." And I realized then that while Marcus might crumble under pressure, Isabel would fight, clawing to protect her position, and I would need to be ready for the storm she would unleash. But as Lucian spoke of contingencies and countermeasures, his voice low and steady, I caught myself studying the faint tension in his jaw, the way his hands tightened when he mentioned Isabel by name, and I wondered for the first time if his investment in this war was entirely strategic, or if he too had begun to feel the dangerous pull that had already begun to unravel me, though neither of us dared name it in that moment, because to do so would have been to admit that vengeance was no longer the only fire burning between us. The storm broke during a masquerade ball thrown by one of Marcus's wealthier allies, a night drenched in silk and music where every mask concealed more than faces, and though I wore a gown of midnight blue that drew murmurs of admiration, I moved through the ballroom with a calm precision, waiting for the cracks to widen, for I knew Lucian's hand was already at work behind the scenes, pulling threads Marcus could not see. And when I caught sight of Marcus across the room, his mask tilted, his smile too forced, I knew the panic was finally seeping into his bones. Yet what caught me off guard was Isabel, radiant in gold, her eyes narrowing when she saw Lucian pause beside me, bowing with that faint curl of his lips that was the closest he ever came to a smile, and though his touch against my arm was brief, the message it sent was not lost on her, nor on Marcus, whose jaw tightened beneath his mask as he approached with a glass of wine and words coated in charm but laced with venom. "You look beautiful tonight, Celine, almost dangerous," and I met his gaze with a serene smile that masked the hatred boiling beneath my skin, replying softly, "Perhaps beauty was always more dangerous than you realized." And though Isabel laughed to smooth the tension, I caught the flicker of unease in her eyes, the first crack in her armor, and later that night when Lucian and I slipped away into the lantern-lit garden, his voice low enough to drown in the shadows, he said, "They're starting to see you, starting to fear you." And for a moment we simply stood in silence, the air charged, his gaze on me like a flame I dared not touch, until finally he added, "Good, fear is the beginning of their end." But the way his hand lingered against the small of my back as we turned to leave told me fear was not the only thing rising between us, and I wondered just how much longer we could deny it. The end came not as a single explosion but as a series of collapsing dominoes, each one set in motion by the evidence Lucian and I had so carefully planted, until Marcus's debts were laid bare in the papers and Isabel's whispered dealings with donors surfaced in scandalous leaks, and the empire they had schemed to build upon my ruin crumbled faster than either of them could contain, with investors abandoning Marcus overnight and Isabel's name dragged through salons and newspapers alike, her golden image tarnished beyond repair, and I watched it all unfold with a calm I had not known in my first life, my hand steady as I signed the documents Lucian placed before me, transferring the remnants of Marcus's projects into holdings tied now to my name. And though the world thought me ruthless, I knew this was justice, for I had died once and would not die again. Yet amid the ashes of their downfall I realized something even more unsettling, for when Marcus cornered me one last time, his once handsome face hollowed by desperation, begging me to believe that Isabel had forced his hand, that he had loved me truly, I felt nothing but contempt. And when Isabel herself arrived days later, weeping at my gate, clutching my hands as though to anchor herself, I saw only the smile she had worn as I fell to my death, and I closed the door without a word, leaving her sobs to fade into silence. But when I turned back, when I found Lucian standing in the doorway with his sharp eyes softened just slightly, I knew that revenge alone had not carried me here, that in choosing him, in standing beside him through fire and shadow, I had found something far more dangerous than betrayal had ever been, a bond forged in power and tempered in trust. and as his hand brushed mine, firm and unyielding, I let myself meet his gaze without fear, knowing that though I had been reborn for vengeance, I would live this life not as a victim, but as the partner of a man the world itself feared, and together we would claim not just what was stolen from me, but everything our enemies had ever dared dream of.